The small town of Millfield had seen better days. Once a thriving manufacturing center in western Pennsylvania, it now wore the tired expression of many Rust Belt communities. Empty storefronts along Main Street, a dwindling population, and an economy propped up by the few remaining factories and the nearby Veterans Affairs Hospital. Yet despite its struggles, Millfield maintained a fierce sense of pride, particularly in its military tradition. The town had sent its sons and daughters to every American conflict since the Civil War, a legacy commemorated by the modest memorial park at the center of town. For Captain Alina Ellie Mitchell, Millfield represented both roots and responsibility. At 34, she had returned to her hometown after 15 years of Army service, including 3 combat tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. Her new assignment as the commander of the local Army Reserve unit wasn't the prestigious position many of her West Point classmates would envy, but it offered something she had come to value after years in combat zones: connection to community and purpose beyond the battlefield. On this crisp October morning, Ellie stood in the town square, watching as her soldiers helped set up for Millfield's annual Veterans Appreciation Day. The event had been a town tradition for decades, bringing together veterans from World War II through the current conflicts for recognition and camaraderie. As the highest-ranking active military officer in town, Ellie had been asked to speak at the ceremony, a responsibility she accepted with appropriate solemnity. "The stage is secure, ma'am," reported Sergeant Luis Rodriguez, her senior non-commissioned officer, as he approached. "Sound system's good to go, and the high school band is running through their final rehearsal." "Thank you, Sergeant," Ellie nodded. "How's the turnout looking?" "VFW says we've got veterans from at least 5 different conflicts registered to attend, including a couple World War II vets, if they're well enough to make it." Ellie felt a flutter of anticipation. Her grandfather had served in World War II, but had passed away before she was born. The opportunity to meet members of that rapidly disappearing generation always felt like a precious connection to her own family history. "Mayor Harrington wants to meet with you about the sequence of events," Rodriguez added. "He's over by the refreshment tent with the town council." As Ellie made her way across the square, she spotted a small commotion near the registration table. A group of teenagers, high school students volunteering for the event, were huddled together, poorly concealing their laughter as they looked toward an elderly man who stood slightly apart from the gathering crowd. The man, who appeared to be in his 90s, was dressed in what seemed to be a military uniform, though not one Ellie immediately recognized. It was clearly aged, the dark blue fabric faded in places, the brass buttons tarnished with time. The cut and style suggested it might date back to World War II, though it didn't match the typical Army or Navy uniforms of that era. The old man stood ramrod straight despite his years, his weathered hands gripping a wooden cane, his expression a mixture of dignity and discomfort as he became aware of the teenager's poorly hidden amusement. Ellie changed direction, approaching the group with purposeful strides. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her captain's bars clearly visible on her own immaculate uniform. The teenagers straightened immediately, their smiles fading under her authoritative gaze. "No, ma'am," one boy answered quickly. "We were just wondering about that old guy's costume," another finished, lowering his voice. "Halloween's not for weeks, and that's not even a real uniform." Ellie's expression remained neutral, though her disappointment was evident in her tone. "I suggest you focus on your assigned duties rather than making judgments about our veterans. Is that clear?" "Yes, ma'am," they murmured, dispersing quickly to their designated tasks. Ellie turned her attention to the elderly man, who had observed the exchange with quiet dignity. As she approached, she offered a respectful nod. "Good morning, sir. I'm Captain Alina Mitchell, commander of the local reserve unit. Welcome to our Veterans Appreciation Day." The old man's eyes, clear and blue despite his advanced age, assessed her uniform before he responded. "Thank you, Captain. Walter Jenkins, pleased to meet you." His voice carried the slight tremor of age, but maintained the crisp enunciation that suggested years of giving orders. "I apologize for those young people," Ellie said. "They meant no disrespect." A slight smile crossed Jenkins' face. "No need to apologize, Captain. Not the first time people have been confused by this old uniform. Gets fewer recognitions with each passing year." Ellie studied the uniform more carefully, noting details she had missed from a distance. the unique arrangement of insignia, the distinctive cut of the lapels. "If you don't mind my asking, sir, which service branch is this uniform from? I don't immediately recognize it." "Merchant Marine," Jenkins replied, a hint of pride entering his voice. "Served as a navigation officer on Liberty ships in the Atlantic and Pacific theaters, 1943 to 1945. Ellie's interest was immediately piqued. The Merchant Marine had played a crucial role in World War II, transporting troops and supplies through submarine-infested waters with casualty rates that rivaled or exceeded many military units. Yet their contribution was often overlooked in popular histories of the war. "That's fascinating, Mr. Jenkins. The Merchant Marine had one of the highest casualty rates of any service during World War II, didn't they?" Surprise and appreciation flickered across the old man's features. "1 in 26 of us died in the line of duty," he confirmed. "Higher rate than any service branch except the Marines. But we weren't classified as veterans until 1988, and even then with limited benefits." Before Ellie could respond, Mayor Harrington approached, his hand extended toward Jenkins. "Walter, glad you could make it this year. Wasn't sure if you were up for the trip from Pittsburgh." "Wouldn't miss it, George," Jenkins replied, shaking the mayor's hand. "My granddaughter drove me down. Last chance to see this old town before she moves to California next month." The mayor turned to Ellie. "I see you've met our oldest returning participant. Walter grew up here in Millfield before moving to Pittsburgh after the war. Been coming to our Veterans Day events for years." "Mr. Jenkins was just telling me about his service in the Merchant Marine," Ellie said. "Oh yes, all those supply runs across the Atlantic. Dangerous business," Harrington nodded before changing the subject. "Captain, we should go over the ceremony schedule. The congressman's office called and he's running 20 minutes late." As the mayor led her away, Ellie glanced back at Jenkins, who had returned to his solitary position, his aged uniform setting him apart from the gathering veterans in more modern military attire. Something about his dignified isolation tugged at her, a sense that his story, and perhaps the stories of others like him, remained untold amidst the more familiar narratives of military service. The morning proceeded with the organized chaos typical of community events. Ellie divided her attention between her official duties and observing the gathering crowd. Veterans of various ages arrived, many in uniform items or vests identifying their service era and branch. Some, particularly the Vietnam-era veterans, gathered in tight groups, their shared experiences creating bonds that excluded outsiders. Others mingled more freely, exchanging stories across generational lines. Jenkins remained somewhat apart, occasionally exchanging brief greetings with the oldest veterans, but primarily watching the proceedings with quiet attention. Ellie noticed that when younger veterans passed him, few seemed to recognize his uniform or acknowledge his status. The Merchant Marine's contribution had indeed faded from public memory, despite its critical importance to the Allied victory. During a brief lull in her duties, Ellie approached Jenkins again. "Would you mind if I asked you more about your service, Mr. Jenkins? I've studied military history extensively, but the Merchant Marine experience isn't covered in much detail, even at West Point." The old man's expression brightened. "Be glad to share what I can remember, Captain. Mine's not what it used to be, but some things you don't forget, no matter how many years pass." As they found seats on a nearby bench, neither Ellie nor Jenkins could have anticipated how this chance conversation would unfold into something far more significant. A journey that would challenge perceptions, bridge generational divides, and ultimately lead to a moment of recognition that would silence the laughter and change Millfield's understanding of service and sacrifice. The Veterans Appreciation Day ceremony proceeded with the expected formalities, the high school band playing patriotic selections, the mayor delivering a welcome speech, local dignitaries offering platitudes about service and sacrifice. Ellie delivered her prepared remarks, focusing on the connection between military service and community, emphasizing that veterans' contributions continued long after they removed their uniforms. Throughout the ceremony, she found her attention repeatedly drawn to Walter Jenkins, who sat in the front row reserved for World War II veterans. There were only 3 others in his row, all in their mid to late 90s, representing the rapidly dwindling ranks of America's oldest living veterans. Unlike the others, who wore caps or jackets identifying their Army, Navy, or Marine Corps service, Jenkins' Merchant Marine uniform remained an anomaly, recognized by few, understood by fewer. After the formal program concluded and the crowd dispersed toward the refreshment areas, Ellie made her way back to Jenkins, who was speaking with an elderly woman Ellie assumed must be his granddaughter. "Mr. Jenkins," she greeted him. "Excellent ceremony, wasn't it?" "Very nicely done, Captain," he nodded. "Allow me to introduce my granddaughter, Dr. Margaret Collins." The woman, who appeared to be in her early 50s, extended her hand. "Please call me Meg. It's a pleasure to meet you, Captain Mitchell. Thank you for taking an interest in my grandfather. Not many people recognize his service these days." "That's precisely what interests me," Ellie admitted. "I'm familiar with most aspects of World War II, but the merchant marine experience isn't well covered in standard military education." Jenkins smiled wryly. "We fell into a bureaucratic crack, you might say, not quite military, not quite civilian, essential to the war effort, but often forgotten when the honors were handed out. Grandfather rarely talked about his experiences when I was growing up," Meg added. "It's only in recent years that he's begun sharing his stories. When you reach my age, you realize there won't be many more chances to tell them," Jenkins said matter-of-factly, "and fewer people left who remember how it really was." Ellie's interest deepened. "Would you be willing to share some of those stories with my reserve unit? We have monthly training weekends, and I've been looking for ways to connect our younger soldiers with the broader history of American military service." Jenkins looked surprised by the invitation. "You think they'd be interested in hearing from an old merchant mariner? Most young folks can't even tell you what a Liberty ship was." "That's precisely why they need to hear from you," Ellie insisted. "Many of them joined after 9/11 and have only known the modern volunteer military. Understanding the full spectrum of service, including the Merchant Marine's vital contribution, would be invaluable." After some gentle persuasion from both Ellie and Meg, Jenkins agreed to speak at the following month's training weekend. As they exchanged contact information, Ellie noticed several of her reserve soldiers watching their interaction with curious expressions. The sight of their commander engaged in extended conversation with a man in an unfamiliar aged uniform had clearly piqued their interest. "Looking forward to hearing your stories, Mr. Jenkins," Ellie said as they parted. "I think you'll find today's soldiers are eager to connect with their historical predecessors, even those from less familiar service branches." "We'll see about that, Captain," Jenkins replied with a hint of skepticism, "though I appreciate your interest regardless." As Jenkins departed with his granddaughter, Sergeant Rodriguez approached Ellie. "Everything okay, ma'am? Couldn't help noticing your conversation with the elderly gentleman." "More than okay, Sergeant. I've just recruited a remarkable speaker for next month's training weekend." She briefly explained Jenkins' merchant marine service, nodding with some disappointment Rodriguez's own look of confusion at the mention of the service branch. "Can't say I know much about the merchant marine in World War II, Captain," he admitted. "Wasn't that just commercial shipping?" "That just commercial shipping delivered the tanks, planes, ammunition, and supplies that made Allied victory possible," Ellie explained. "They sailed through submarine-infested waters, often unarmed or lightly armed, taking losses at rates that would horrify modern military planners." Rodriguez looked suitably chastened. "I had no idea, ma'am. Looking forward to learning more from Mr. Jenkins." Over the following weeks, Ellie found herself increasingly invested in Jenkins' upcoming presentation. She contacted him several times to coordinate logistics and check on his health and comfort needs for the event. During these conversations, she began to learn more about his specific experiences. 3 Liberty ships sunk beneath him during his service, weeks spent on a life raft in the North Atlantic after one sinking, the loss of countless friends to German U-boats and Japanese aircraft. The more she learned, the more Ellie recognized that Jenkins' story represented a significant gap in most Americans' understanding of World War II service. When she mentioned the upcoming presentation to fellow officers at a regional command meeting, she was met with the same lack of recognition she had observed in others. "Merchant Marine, they weren't really military, were they?" asked one major from a nearby reserve unit. "They faced enemy fire and died in service to their country," Ellie responded firmly. "Whether they fell under the Department of Defense or not seems a technicality when you're on a burning ship in the middle of the ocean." The day before Jenkins' scheduled presentation, Ellie received an unexpected phone call from Meg Collins. "Captain Mitchell, I wanted to let you know that Grandfather is feeling somewhat anxious about tomorrow," she began. He's concerned that the soldiers might find his experiences irrelevant or, worse, amusing. Why would he think that? Ellie asked, surprised. There was an incident at his senior living community, Meg explained. He wore his uniform for their Veterans Day event, and some visiting teenagers made jokes about it looking like a costume or a made-up uniform. It affected him more than he let on at the time. Ellie felt a surge of protective indignation. I can assure you, Dr. Collins, that my soldiers will show your grandfather the utmost respect, and they'll learn something valuable in the process. I appreciate that, Meg replied. He's 97. His generation doesn't show vulnerability easily, but these slights cut deeper than he admits. After the call ended, Ellie sat at her desk, contemplating how best to prepare her unit for Jenkins' visit. The incident with the teenagers at the town event came back to her, the casual dismissal of something they didn't recognize or understand. She was determined that her soldiers would not display similar ignorance. The next morning, before Jenkins' arrival, Ellie gathered her unit of 60 reserve soldiers in the classroom at their training facility. Many looked curious about the unscheduled briefing. Before today's guest speaker arrives, I want to provide some context, she began. Walter Jenkins served in the United States Merchant Marine during World War II. Some of you may not be familiar with this service branch, which is precisely why his presentation is so valuable. She activated a presentation she had prepared, showing historical images of Liberty ships, merchant marine crews, and statistics about their casualties and contributions. The Merchant Marine transported over 85% of war materials to Army, Navy, Marine, and Air Forces overseas. Their casualty rate was 1 in 26 servicemen, higher than any branch except the Marine Corps. She paused, making eye contact with various soldiers around the room. These men were not recognized as veterans until decades after the war. Many never received the benefits or acknowledgments that other service members did. When Mr. Jenkins arrives, I expect every one of you to show him the respect his service deserves. The room remained silent as Ellie's words sank in. She could see expressions shifting from curiosity to somber understanding as the soldiers processed the statistics and images on the screen. Any questions before Mr. Jenkins arrives? She asked. A young specialist raised her hand. Ma'am, why weren't they recognized as veterans right away if they were taking casualties like that? Bureaucratic distinctions, Ellie explained. The Merchant Marine served under the War Shipping Administration, not the Department of War or Navy. Despite facing the same enemies and dangers, this technical distinction kept them from veteran status until 1988, when Congress finally passed the Merchant Marine Fairness Act. Another hand rose. Were they armed, ma'am? Could they fight back against submarines or aircraft? Some ships had small defensive armaments, often a single gun managed by a Navy Armed Guard detachment. But they were cargo ships, not warships. Their primary mission was to deliver supplies, not engage enemy forces. Ellie checked her watch. Mr. Jenkins should be arriving momentarily. I trust you'll all make him feel welcome and valued. As her soldiers filed out to the main hall where Jenkins would speak, Ellie remained behind briefly, considering the impact of what she was trying to accomplish. This wasn't just about educating her unit or honoring one elderly veteran. It was about challenging assumptions regarding what constituted service and sacrifice, a question that remained relevant even in modern military operations, where contractors, aid workers, and others often faced combat dangers alongside uniformed personnel. When she entered the hall, Walter Jenkins had already arrived, seated in a chair near the podium. He wore his Merchant Marine uniform, freshly pressed for the occasion, with his service ribbons carefully arranged. Despite the confidence of his posture, Ellie could detect a hint of apprehension in his expression as he observed the young soldiers filing into the room. Moving to his side, Ellie greeted him warmly. Mr. Jenkins, thank you for coming today. We're honored to have you share your experiences with us. I appreciate the invitation, Captain, he replied, his voice steadier than it had been during their previous meetings. Though I'm still not entirely convinced these young folks will find an old man's stories particularly relevant to modern service. Trust me, Ellie assured him, what you have to share transcends technological changes or the passing decades. Some aspects of service and sacrifice remain constant, regardless of the era. As she helped him to the podium and prepared to introduce him to the assembled soldiers, Ellie couldn't have anticipated how prophetic her words would prove to be, or how a simple presentation to a small reserve unit would eventually set in motion events that would lead to one of the most profound moments of recognition in Walter Jenkins' long life. The atmosphere in the hall shifted perceptibly as Walter Jenkins began his presentation. What had started with polite, but somewhat dutiful attention from the soldiers evolved into genuine engagement as Jenkins recounted his experiences in straightforward, unembellished terms. "We sailed in convoys when possible," he explained, standing despite Ellie's offer of a chair. 30, 40 ships together for mutual protection, escorted by whatever Navy vessels could be spared. But there were never enough escorts, and the U-boats hunted in what they called wolf packs, multiple submarines coordinating their attacks. He described the tension of night watches, peering into darkness for the telltale wake of a torpedo, and the helpless horror of watching nearby ships hit and sinking, strict radio silence preventing any calls for assistance. "The worst crossing was in early 43, Jenkins continued, his voice steady despite the gravity of his memories. "We lost 7 ships from our convoy in a single night. You'd see the explosion, the flash lighting up the night sky, and then just darkness. By morning, there'd be empty spaces in the convoy where ships had been, maybe some debris floating if you passed near enough. But you couldn't stop. The convoy had to maintain course and speed. Stopping to search for survivors just made you the next target." The soldiers listened in rapt silence, many leaning forward in their seats. This wasn't the sanitized, strategic overview of World War II they had learned in history classes. This was the ground level, or rather sea level, reality of war, told by someone who had lived through its most terrifying moments. Jenkins described his third sinking in the Pacific, when a Japanese aircraft had attacked his Liberty ship carrying ammunition to American forces in the Philippines. "The first bomb missed, but the second hit near the stern. We had 5 minutes, maybe less, before the ammunition would go up. The captain ordered abandon ship immediately." His voice grew softer, forcing the soldiers to lean in further to hear him. "I was the last one off the bridge. Made my way down to the lifeboats, but found most were already gone or damaged from the explosion. Found a life raft that had partially deployed and was hanging from its davits. As I was trying to free it, the ammunition detonated." Jenkins paused, his eyes focused on some distant point, seeing not the assembled soldiers but the events of over 7 decades ago. "The blast threw me clear of the ship. When I came to, I was floating in debris. The ship was gone, and I had this." He gestured to a long scar running along his forearm. "Piece of metal nearly took my arm off. Spent 19 hours in the water before a Navy destroyer picked me up." For almost an hour, Jenkins held the room's complete attention, describing not just the dangers and hardships, but also the camaraderie, the shared purpose, and the pride in delivering the materials that kept the war effort moving forward. When he finally concluded his presentation, the silence held for a moment before the soldiers rose in a spontaneous standing ovation. Ellie, watching from the side of the room, felt a swell of satisfaction at the genuine respect evident in her soldiers' faces. The skepticism she had initially encountered when mentioning the merchant marine had been replaced by clear recognition of Jenkins' service and sacrifices. The question and answer session that followed was equally engaging, with soldiers asking thoughtful questions about everything from technical aspects of the Liberty ships to the psychological impact of knowing that German or Japanese forces were specifically targeting transport vessels. One of her staff sergeants asked, "Sir, how did you and your crew handle the knowledge that you weren't officially considered military personnel, despite facing the same dangers?" Jenkins considered the question carefully. "At the time, we didn't dwell on it much. There was a war to win, and our job was getting supplies to where they were needed. The distinction seemed less important when you were in the middle of the Atlantic with U-boats hunting you." He paused. "It was after the war that the bureaucratic classifications became more apparent, when many of us couldn't access veteran benefits or receive certain recognitions." Another soldier asked about the specific training merchant mariners received. "Nothing like what you folks go through," Jenkins admitted. "I had maritime academy training because I was a navigation officer. Many of the crew were experienced merchant seamen from before the war, but some were young men who received just weeks of training before being assigned to ships. The demand for crews was so high that training was often compressed to get ships moving. You learned the rest on the job, sometimes with enemy fire as your teacher." After the formal session concluded, many soldiers approached Jenkins individually, shaking his hand and asking additional questions. Ellie observed with quiet pride as her unit demonstrated the respect she had hoped for. Sergeant Rodriguez approached her as the gathering began to disperse. "That was eye-opening, ma'am. Can't believe we don't learn more about the Merchant Marine's role in standard military education." "That's precisely why I wanted Mr. Jenkins to speak with us," Ellie replied. "There are aspects of our service history that get overshadowed by more prominent narratives. His experiences with those U-boat attacks, not having proper armaments, watching other ships go down and not being able to help." Rodriguez shook his head. "That's a different kind of courage than what we typically think of in combat situations." "Different but no less valuable," Ellie agreed. "Sometimes standing your post and continuing your mission despite terror and helplessness requires more courage than actively engaging an enemy." As the training day concluded and soldiers departed, Ellie escorted Jenkins to his granddaughter's waiting car. The old man seemed energized by the experience, his earlier apprehension replaced by evident satisfaction. "Thank you for this opportunity, Captain," he said as they reached the parking lot. "It's been a long time since I've spoken about those days to such an attentive audience." "The honor was ours, Mr. Jenkins. You've given my soldiers a perspective they wouldn't have gained from any training manual or history book." Meg Collins emerged from her car, smiling at her grandfather's animated expression. "I take it the presentation went well." "Better than I expected," Jenkins admitted. "These young soldiers asked good questions, showed real interest." "They recognize service and sacrifice when they see it," Ellie said, "regardless of the uniform." As they said their goodbyes, Ellie was struck by an idea. "Mr. Jenkins, our unit has been invited to participate in the Veterans Day ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery next month. Would you consider attending as our guest? I think it would be meaningful for my soldiers to share that experience with you." Jenkins looked surprised by the invitation. "Arlington, that's a significant event." "Yes, sir. This year includes a special recognition of World War II veterans, given their dwindling numbers. The president is scheduled to attend and speak." Jenkins glanced at his granddaughter, who nodded encouragingly. "I haven't been to Arlington since my wife's brother was buried there in '56. He was Army, killed in Korea." "We'd ensure your comfort throughout the event," Ellie assured him. "It would mean a great deal to have you there." After a moment's consideration, Jenkins nodded. "I'd be honored, Captain, assuming these old bones cooperate." "Wonderful. I'll make all the arrangements and coordinate with Dr. Collins on the details." As Jenkins and his granddaughter drove away, Ellie remained in the parking lot, contemplating the day's success. What had begun as a simple educational opportunity for her unit had evolved into something more significant, a chance to help restore recognition to a veteran whose service had been institutionally marginalized for decades. She couldn't have known then that the Arlington ceremony would bring unexpected developments, challenges and opportunities that would test her commitment to Jenkins' recognition, while creating the possibility for a moment of national acknowledgement that neither of them had anticipated. In the weeks that followed, Ellie coordinated the logistics for her unit's participation in the Arlington ceremony while maintaining regular contact with Meg Collins regarding her grandfather's health and travel arrangements. Jenkins, despite his advanced age, remained determined to attend, though Meg reported that his energy levels fluctuated, and some days were better than others. Ellie's superior officers raised eyebrows at her request to include a Merchant Marine veteran in their official delegation, but her passionate advocacy eventually won their approval. Her persistence was fueled by a growing conviction that Jenkins' story represented not just an overlooked historical footnote, but an important lesson for current military members about the diverse forms service could take. What she didn't realize was that her efforts on Jenkins' behalf would soon intersect with larger currents of recognition and remembrance, creating an opportunity for a moment of public acknowledgement that would transcend their initial expectations. The morning of the Arlington ceremony dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline November sky that made the white headstones seem to glow against the perfectly maintained green lawns. Ellie's reserve unit had arrived early for the security processing and positioning that such high-profile events required. They stood in formation near the tomb of the unknown soldier, their dress uniforms immaculate, awaiting the beginning of the ceremony. Walter Jenkins, accompanied by his granddaughter, had been escorted to a special seating area reserved for World War II veterans. Ellie had visited him briefly before taking her position with her unit, finding him alert and solemn in his merchant marine uniform, which he had supplemented with a heavy overcoat against the November chill. "Everything comfortable, Mr. Jenkins?" she had asked, nodding that Meg had equipped him with a warm blanket and thermos of hot coffee. "Quite comfortable, thank you, Captain," he'd replied, his eyes taking in the sprawling cemetery with its perfectly aligned headstones. "Been many years since I've been here. Forgotten how it affects you, all those stones, all those stories." "The ceremony should begin in about 30 minutes. The president is scheduled to arrive at 1100 hours. Jenkins had nodded, a hint of nervousness showing through his composed exterior. "Still not entirely sure why you wanted an old merchant mariner at this military ceremony, Captain. Appreciate the invitation, but I hope I'm not out of place." "You belong here as much as anyone," Ellie had assured him firmly. "Your service helped make victory possible in World War II, regardless of how bureaucracy classified it afterward." Now, standing with her unit, Ellie could see Jenkins in the distance, one of perhaps 24 World War II veterans assembled for the ceremony. Their numbers diminished with each passing year, making their presence at such events increasingly precious. Most were in wheelchairs or used walking assistants, their bodies having finally begun to surrender to time even as their spirits remained strong. The ceremony commenced with the arrival of senior military leaders and government officials. Ellie noted Congressman Howard Mills, who represented their district in Pennsylvania, among the dignitaries. Mills had been a vocal advocate for veterans' issues, though Ellie wasn't aware of any specific interest in merchant marine veterans. At precisely 1100, a murmur passed through the crowd as the president's motorcade arrived. Security personnel moved with practiced efficiency as the president emerged from his vehicle and made his way to the podium. The national anthem played, followed by an invocation from the military chaplain. The president's speech began with the expected acknowledgments of sacrifice and service, praising the men and women who had defended American values across generations of conflict. Ellie listened attentively, though her attention occasionally shifted to Jenkins, visible in his distinctive uniform among the aged veterans. Midway through the speech, the president's tone became more personal. "Today, as we honor all who have served, I want to especially recognize our World War II veterans, who now represent our most senior generation of warriors. Their numbers diminish each day, making our duty to remember and honor their service all the more sacred." He gestured toward the assembled World War II veterans. "Among those with us today are representatives from each service branch that fought in that monumental conflict: Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, Army Air Forces, and the often overlooked but critically important United States Merchant Marine." Ellie straightened involuntarily at the specific mention of the Merchant Marine. This level of recognition wasn't common in official ceremonies, which typically focused on the traditional armed forces branches. The president continued, "I recently received a letter from Congressman Mills sharing the story of a merchant marine veteran from his district, a man who survived 3 ship sinkings while delivering vital war materials across both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. This veteran's story reminds us that service and sacrifice took many forms during that global conflict, and that the distinctions we sometimes make between various types of service can obscure the shared courage and commitment they all represent." Ellie's pulse quickened as she realized the president was referring to Jenkins. She glanced toward Congressman Mills, wondering how he had learned of Jenkins' story, then remembered that Mills had attended the Millfield Veterans Appreciation Day. He must have either spoken with Jenkins directly or learned of his story afterward. "I'm told that this veteran, Mr. Walter Jenkins, is with us today," the president continued, scanning the assembly of elderly veterans. "Mr. Jenkins, if you're able, would you please stand to be recognized?" In the World War II Veterans section, there was a moment of movement as Meg helped her grandfather to his feet. Jenkins stood tall despite his 97 years, his faded blue merchant marine uniform instantly distinguishable among the more familiar military uniforms surrounding him. What happened next wasn't part of the planned ceremony. The president stepped away from the podium and walked directly to where Jenkins stood. The security detail moved with him, their expressions professional but their body language conveying surprise at this deviation from the program. The crowd fell silent as the president approached Jenkins, television cameras following the unexpected movement. When the president stopped before the elderly veteran, he did something that made the moment instantly historic. He raised his hand in a formal salute to the merchant marine veteran. Jenkins, trained in military courtesy despite the civilian classification of his service, returned the salute with perfect form, his aged hand steady as it rose to his brow. The president then extended his hand, which Jenkins shook with visible emotion. Though the microphones didn't capture their brief exchange, those nearby would later report that the president said simply, "Thank you for your service and sacrifice, Mr. Jenkins. Your country is grateful, even if that gratitude was long delayed." The moment, captured by every news camera present, created an electric atmosphere throughout the ceremony grounds. Ellie felt her throat tighten with emotion as she watched Jenkins receive the presidential acknowledgement, a validation not just for him personally, but for all merchant mariners whose contributions had been institutionally minimized for decades. The ceremony continued according to protocol after the president returned to the podium, but the unexpected moment of recognition had transformed the event from standard observance to something more profound. When Ellie looked around at her soldiers, she saw in their expressions a deeper understanding of the day's significance. After the ceremony concluded and the president had departed, Ellie made her way through the dispersing crowd to where Jenkins was receiving congratulations from those around him. His face showed a mixture of pride and disbelief at what had just occurred. "Mr. Jenkins," she greeted him, unable to keep the emotion from her voice. "That was extraordinary." "Quite unexpected," he agreed, his own voice unsteady. "Never thought I'd live to see the commander-in-chief salute a merchant mariner." Congressman Mills approached, shaking Jenkins' hand warmly. "Mr. Jenkins, I hope you don't mind that I shared your story with the president. After hearing about your experiences from Captain Mitchell and witnessing the impact of your presentation to her reserve unit, I felt your story deserved broader recognition." "I'm grateful, Congressman," Jenkins replied. "Though it wasn't just my story, I represented thousands of merchant mariners today, many who didn't survive to see any recognition." As the conversation continued, Ellie noticed something remarkable happening around them. Veterans from other service branches, many significantly younger than Jenkins, were approaching to shake his hand and express their respect. The same uniform that had once drawn confused looks or even quiet mockery now attracted gestures of genuine appreciation. A Vietnam veteran in a wheelchair rolled up, extending his hand to Jenkins. "Sir, I served on Navy vessels escorting supply ships to Vietnam. Never fully appreciated what those merchant crews faced until today. Thank you for your service." Another veteran, wearing a Desert Storm cap, added, "My grandfather was Navy armed guard on merchant ships in World War II. He always said the merchant mariners had the tougher job. They couldn't fight back, just had to keep sailing and delivering the goods no matter what came at them." These interactions continued as they made their way toward the cemetery exit, each one seeming to add new strength to Jenkins' bearing despite his physical fragility. By the time they reached the parking area where Meg's car waited, Jenkins was visibly tired but energized by the unexpected recognition. "Captain Mitchell," he said as they prepared to part, "I owe you a debt of gratitude. None of this would have happened if you hadn't taken an interest in an old man's stories." "The debt runs the other way, Mr. Jenkins," Ellie replied sincerely. "You've given my soldiers and me a deeper understanding of service and sacrifice that transcends formal classifications or uniforms. That's a gift beyond measure." Later that evening, as Ellie watched the news coverage of the ceremony in her hotel room, she was struck by how prominently Jenkins' moment with the president featured in the reporting. Commentators were discussing the history of the merchant marine, many acknowledging their own limited awareness of the service's contributions and casualties during World War II. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Sergeant Rodriguez. "Saw Jenkins on the news. Our guy is famous now. Whole unit is proud." The message captured what Ellie was feeling, pride not just in Jenkins' recognition, but in her unit's role in helping bring attention to his service. What had begun as a simple educational opportunity had evolved into a moment of national recognition for an overlooked category of World War II veterans. 3 days later, back in Millfield, Ellie visited Jenkins at his granddaughter's home, where he was staying before returning to Pittsburgh. The media attention had continued, with several national news organizations requesting interviews about his service and his moment with the president. "How are you handling all the attention?" Ellie asked, finding him seated in a comfortable chair surrounded by newspapers featuring his photograph. "It's overwhelming," Jenkins admitted. "At my age, you don't expect to become the center of attention, but Meg has been helping manage the interview requests, making sure I don't overextend myself." "You've become a spokesperson for merchant mariners everywhere," Ellie observed. "Your moment with the president has sparked renewed interest in their contributions." Jenkins nodded thoughtfully. "That's the part that matters most to me, not the personal recognition, but the acknowledgement of what the merchant marine accomplished and sacrificed." He gestured to a stack of mail on a nearby table. "I've received letters from families of merchant mariners who never came home, thanking me for bringing attention to their loved one's service. That means more than any presidential salute." Ellie understood completely. Throughout her military career, she had observed how recognition often flowed unevenly, sometimes based on service branch, military occupation, or even gender rather than actual contribution or sacrifice. Jenkins' moment had challenged those hierarchies, demonstrating that courage and service could wear many uniforms. "The Historical Society has asked me to donate my uniform and some photographs for a special exhibit," Jenkins continued. "They're creating a display about the Merchant Marines' role in World War II as part of their military history collection." "That's wonderful," Ellie smiled. "Permanent recognition in your hometown." "And they've asked you to speak at the exhibit opening," he added. "Said it was your recognition of an old man's service that started this whole chain of events." Ellie felt a surge of emotion at this unexpected acknowledgement of her role. "I'd be honored, though I did very little. You're the one who lived the history and had the courage to share it." "Sometimes all it takes is one person paying attention," Jenkins replied, his weathered face crinkling in a smile. "One person who sees value where others see only an old man in an unfamiliar uniform." In the months that followed, Jenkins' story continued to resonate beyond Millfield. The presidential salute had created a ripple effect, with increased attention to merchant marine contributions in historical discussions and veterans events. Several documentary filmmakers contacted Jenkins for interviews about his experiences, and a bill was introduced in Congress to award a Congressional Gold Medal to merchant marine veterans of World War II. Long overdue recognition that Jenkins would live to see passed and signed into law the following year. For Ellie, the experience reinforced her belief in the power of individual recognition to create broader change. What had begun as a simple act of respect toward an elderly veteran had expanded into a reevaluation of how service and sacrifice were acknowledged in American military culture. On Veterans Day the following year, Millfield's ceremony featured a new addition, a permanent exhibit honoring the town's merchant marine veterans alongside those from traditional military branches. The centerpiece was a photograph of Walter Jenkins in his uniform, standing tall despite his years, receiving the presidential salute that had validated not just his service, but that of thousands like him who had sailed dangerous waters to ensure Allied victory. As Ellie stood before the exhibit during its dedication, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The teenagers who had once laughed at Jenkins' unfamiliar uniform were now among those learning about the merchant marine's critical wartime role. The president's salute had silenced the laughter, but more importantly, it had opened a space for education and understanding. Jenkins himself, though increasingly limited by age, continued sharing his experiences with school groups and military units when his health permitted. His once overlooked uniform had become a symbol of recognition for service that transcended traditional categories, a reminder that courage and sacrifice could take forms not always captured in official histories or popular narratives. For Captain Alina Mitchell, the experience had transformed her approach to command and leadership. She had always valued military tradition and protocol, but now understood more deeply that true respect required looking beyond formal classifications to recognize the essential humanity and courage in all forms of service. The old man's uniform, once a curiosity that drew confused looks or dismissive laughter, had become a powerful symbol of overdue recognition, a reminder that honor and respect, like the presidential salute that had acknowledged them, could arrive late but still carry profound meaning for those who had served in the shadows of more celebrated contributions.